Well, follow along as I make another diorama using this little stand I found at a thrift store, I think. This week, instead of making something random, I figured I'd combine my love of making dioramas and Warhammer to make my first Warhammer diorama. I got these 5 Alpha Legionnaires that I will never play with. At one point, when I first started building Chaos Space Marines, I planned to have at least one unit painted for every Chaos chapter, but I quickly scrapped that idea. But these guys still remain, and I figured why not just make them a forever home, because I don't need any more Legionnaires, and I'll use that bottom OSL as kind of the theme, or at least add an element of it as we go forward. First step was removing these guys from their base, which was the scariest part, and I figured if I mess that up, I shouldn't even make this diorama, so I started there. But it was easy. I used super glue, so they popped right off. And then I got started building. The size of that little platform that I planned as using as the display pedestal was pretty small, so I knew that I needed to add some elevation to get all of these people on here without it being too crowded. So I figured the best way to do that is add some stairs. I figured I'd go for that these Legionnaires were like teleporting into a Imperium Cathedral or something. I got a bunch of Battle Sister models or boxes that I can find some pieces to add to the terrain. So I started to cut out smaller and smaller or shorter and shorter pieces of cork to make these stairs. Wanting to save on space even more and make it a little bit more dynamic than just flat stairs, I figured I'd make them like circular stairs, which I feel is pretty fitting for a cathedral. So I took this to-go lid, I think. I keep a bunch of them around to either mix stuff or I guess measure stuff to find this circular for the base, and then I use that base piece once I cut it out to be the stencil for all of the pieces going all the way up. And then I glued them all together, and this is what I got. I kind of figured out a general layout of where I wanted these guys to stand. I knew one of them was going to be like on the stairs instead of just on top of it, so I knew I needed to cut out a fair amount of cork to fit that in. It was all going to be wrapped around in cotton, so it wouldn't be that noticeable. And then from there I kind of just started putting some cracks down, hitting where all 5 of the people would be at. That way I could have a lot more of that kind of warp or teleport green glow that I plan to have coming up from the stair texture, as well as the cotton clouds that I was going to glue on. And then I moved on to adding on some detritus and dead Imperium soldiers. I glued on a broken column that was 3D printed over a year ago, and I have no clue what it's from, but it's finally finding some use. I also tried to carve a staff out of styrofoam with the Aquila, but that failed pretty quickly, so I luckily found a Aquila emblem from the Rhino kit, glued that to styrofoam, and with the styrene rod made a staff. I also glued on a ammo belt from a Penitent engine kit, a dead Battle Sister also from the Rhino kit, a shield from the Sacrosanct kit, and a helmet from the Zephyr kit. And that was kind of all of the elements that I added in. I've seen a bunch of people on YouTube use that cool baby wipe trick to make marble texture, but I don't know what special baby wipes they have, because every time I try to dry it out and pull it apart to get that marble-like pattern, it just tore. But I still gave it a try anyways, and it failed. And then I remembered that I had cheesecloth, and I was like, I bet that'll work. So I tried that out, and that also failed. And at that point I realized I didn't even want marble texture. I really wanted granite texture. So I just put the airbrush away. Unfortunately, this is a trend that will continue for this video. I forgot to film the next part. All I did was take 2 different grays, and I stippled them across everything to give me that good random stony base. And then I used that same stippling technique to get that kind of pinkish to darker red or kind of brick red color you see in granite. I started with pink horror that I kind of went everywhere with, and then I took Word Bearer's red and did a little bit less with that same stippling technique, and then lastly with Gal Vorback red, so going from lightest to dark. And then I kind of just did that over and over and over again until the pattern was something that I liked. And then I took pallid witch flesh and dotted in some white. I also took just matte black and dotted in some black specks as well. And then I dry brushed everything, or at least all of the edges, with a mixture of that pink horror and pallid witch flesh. I actually did this next part before I did those dots of white and black, but I didn't want to go back and do the voiceover. But after I did all the dry brushing and stippling, I added a wash over everything. It was a mixture of about 75% Agrax Earthshade and 25% Druchii Violet. And then I kind of went back and see where I wanted some more of those purplish, pinkish tones. And I did some washes of that Druchii Violet again, as well as Carroburg Crimson. And I especially did a lot of that Carroburg Crimson alongside those cracks. The next part was painting up all those little pieces I added. And honestly, I didn't do anything special. If anything, it was some of my worst painting in a while. I just forgot how to properly highlight black with gray, I guess. But honestly, everything ended up being either covered in blood effects or OSL glow, so it didn't matter. And it's kind of just a side piece. So if you are making something like this, just kind of paint it up so it's noticeable, but it doesn't need to be the best thing you've ever made. The only thing that I did kind of special was on that golden staff. I was really messy with the super glue, so it was noticeable on the texture. So I ended up painting all of that dark bronze highlighted gold like I did all the rest of the gold. And then I did some glazes of Carroburg Crimson as well as Fuegan Orange, or whatever the orange Citadel shade is, to kind of give it that hot molten metal effect. And then that was kind of everything painted except for the OSLs. I tend to always do this when I'm painting OSLs on surfaces and think that I'm going to be way neater with my white ink. Do the process of like thinning down white ink and trying to get it into those crevices. But compared to like a Warhammer model that has those really nice and defined cracks, these things that I carved were not that deep. So it didn't really pull in the recesses and it muddied up the surface. But I kind of just kept going. I did that same process with a green fluorescent, getting it into those cracks. And then I went back and just used that same granite technique to cover up all the parts that got messy. I also darkened the edges with some Biel-Tan green shade, so there was some diffusion of that light. And then I also painted some black edges alongside those cracks. But honestly, later on, I put pigment powders on it, and I could have skipped that last step because the pigment powders did that and better once I was finished. Then it was finally time to glue on those Alpha Legionnaires. I honestly forgot what layout I wanted, so I just glued them on how it looked best. And then I started to add some cotton around them. The cotton balls I have are either old or just cheap, so I couldn't get them that thin, but I worked around to eventually get it to a kind of layout and texture that I wanted. I wanted a few of them to kind of be fully engulfed in that smoke or teleport haze and kind of be stepping out, and then some of them to be mostly visible with just some of it wrapped around their feet. And I was pretty happy with how this layout ended up. And then from there, it was kind of the normal OSL workflow, so I moved back to the airbrush. I took white ink and made a halo around that cotton, so it would be like where the teleport energy was coming from, as well as around some of the bigger cracks. I then took green fluorescent and covered all of those white areas and a little bit of overspray, so there was a little bit more of that diffusion. And then I took a green airbrush paint, not ink, and added a little bit of variety to that haze, so it wasn't all just that fluorescent. And then I also took Biel-Tan green, lowered down the pressure on the compressor for the airbrush, and added in some of that diffusion so I didn't have to do it all with the hairy brush. And then I went back to the painting desk and once again forgot to film the next part, but I kind of just highlighted those areas that would catch the light the most with a really light green or a green mixed with white. and then I touched up some of those spots that needed to be a little bit more shaded, especially on the Alpha Legionnaires themselves with that same Beal Tan shade. And then I moved on to some pigment powders. I used this darker iron oxide to kind of circle around the areas that would be burnt. This is what I was mentioning earlier. I used this around the cracks, which really helped with that kind of burning, crackling energy, as well as around that molten metal from that staff. And then I also took a lighter color, I think it's burnt umber, to just add in some of that debris feeling around some of the broken rubble, especially around that broken column. And then lastly, I just cleaned up those edges with some black acrylic, and I took some glamour shots. Thanks for watching.